Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Louisa Hann, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Craig Gent to discuss his new book, Cyberboss: The Rise of Algorithmic Management and the New Struggle for Control at Work, which is forthcoming with Verso Books later this month. Craig is a writer, editor, and a researcher, as well as a director at Novara Media. Previously, he held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Warwick, and he's published work in Jacobin, Vice, and Independent. Welcome to the show, Craig.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining me. I look forward to chatting about your book. So just kind of give an intro. Your book kind of caught my eye when I was looking for authors to interview, even though kind of the labour politics of algorithms isn't necessarily something I've got much knowledge of. But I did think your book looked like an interesting contribution to a field that addresses how workers are kind of being exploited by fast changing and often quite opaque digital technologies, especially as conditions seem to be worsening for so many people right now. And I was also really interested in the book's discussion of unions and some of the kind of less effective or counterintuitive strategies for dealing with the disempowering aspects of algorithmic management, as well as some of the alternative ways workers have kind of been subverting them. So that's kind of enough from me. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to write the book and its basic overarching thesis?
Yeah, so I've had a really long-standing interest in work and the politics of work for, God, about 12 years now or so. And in that time, I've thought a lot about how work is changing and observed conversations around the future of work, and really sort of tried to keep a sense of like what the stakes are in the changes of work that we see and people's sort of concerns. And I'd say concerns and hopes, but more often it is anxiety about the future of work and the direction of travel. And in particular, I've had this interest in the digital mediation of labor and social relations, really, and this kind of sense that digital technologies have got something to do with the anxieties that we're facing. Now, much of the discourse, I guess, is quite, I would say, economistic, and looks at things like automation and um, sort of mass technological unemployment and stuff like that. But I feel like with the emergence of algorithmic management, it really seems to point to something a bit deeper and more fundamental about working life and um, isn't simply about the automation of jobs, for example. And so it seemed to me like both a more realistic prospect of something that we need to sort of track and be mindful of the stakes of in within the future of work, because it's much easier to manage and discipline human workers than to replace them all en masse with robots. It's cheaper, but also I feel like when we introduce technologies into workplaces, it has an effect on really the sort of like power relations that define a huge chunk of our lives.
So in terms of, you kind of just touched on this, but in terms of the current literature that's available on automation and algorithms, within a kind of a labour context, I think recent years has seen the publication of quite a wealth of critical studies that explore the kind of current effects of new technologies on the world of work. So I wonder if you could just go a little bit more into, some of the primary debates into which you're kind of intervening and what gaps you're actually addressing.
Yeah, so like I said, there's this sort of sense that there's this like nexus of anxieties about the future of work, and it involves a number of things, not just technology, but involves concerns around pay and conditions, so like 0 hours contracts in the UK and things like that, and also concerns around things like bogus self-employment. We see this in the gig economy, for example. And then there is this kind of like sense that accompanies a lot of these debates whenever they're had, whether it's through trade unions or whether it's in parliamentary debates in the kind of like committees of parliament. There's this sort of sense that there's like a technological character to the work, that maybe the technologies are enabling more precarious forms of working, for example. But yet, I think within those debates, there's often a bit of a reluctance to engage with the technologies on their own terms, or look at technology itself as a sort of distinct site of struggle. And the problem with that really is that, I mean, my wager within the book is that I sort of don't think that if you just fixed conditions like pay and contracts, that would necessarily make the work better. I think there's still something about what the technologies do to work and working life itself that is degrading and dehumanizing in and of itself. And so in a way, it's kind of like, I suppose, stepping back from the book, I feel like maybe I wanted to make it kind of like a sort of like a humanist intervention into a debate that is often talked about in terms of sort of like a social scientific or economistic debate, really. And so what the book does in that context is it looks at a lot of the same industries that other people have been looking at, whether it's logistics or the gig economy, which we might talk about in a bit. But I feel like these are kind of like pathfinder sectors in a way for these technologies that are now being rolled out further and further. And it looks at those, but really with a sort of a squarer focus on the relationship between technology and humans, rather than focusing also on the kind of things like precariousness, because that is being done pretty well in literature and also within the debates that are happening in the area.
Yeah, and in terms of how you kind of approach the book, because a lot of the literature you're kind of talking about, I've noticed a tend towards like ethnographic stuff where people go and they actually try the jobs, and they try their hand at it. But your book kind of weaves in these personal stories with the kind of broader political analysis really well, I think. So yeah, how kind of did you go about approaching and finding people to interview? Were there any barriers that kind of prevented you from learning more about certain things, do you think?
Yeah, huge barriers. I mean, when I started out this whole sort of research strand, I probably had the same sort of impulses, and I thought, oh, it'd be really good to go sort of ethnographically experience the work and stuff. And that's not from a kind of like sort of research safari point of view as such. Like I, as I say at the very beginning of the book, like I used to work in a fulfillment center myself when I was a teenager. And it looked, I worked in a sort of relative tin can that looks very different from quite quite technological workplaces that they've become. But like I have a sort of background in this area, and I think very quickly I realized two things. One was that I think like methodologically, I don't think it was necessarily like the right way forward. Like I really wanted to develop our kind of like, I guess like political theoretical understandings of the technology. And that meant looking at a number of different workplaces, and it just wouldn't have been feasible to do that myself. But there's also sort of like real barriers to access in terms of literally accessing workplaces. Some of these workplaces are the most sort of highly securitized workplaces, like outside of the defense industry, that it's really, really hard to get in as a researcher into an Amazon warehouse, for example. What I have within the book, and it does feature an Amazon warehouse, but it was within a very sort of tightly curated public tour, sort of limited public tour that they were running. But I speak to a number of workers who work in various sections of the logistics supply chain or within the gig economy. And the way I went about sort of speaking to these workers was through kind of initially through like extended activist networks, people who are thinking about logistics in particular politically, or who are thinking about forms of political mobilization within the gig economy. But then once I'd met a number of sort of key sort of participants, then I was able to meet many more.
Great. So we've been talking about kind of algorithmic management and using these kind of words and not really introduced the concept properly. So I think it'd be helpful if we just kind of yeah, if you could just clarify what kinds of technologies we're actually talking about, in terms of, what is an algorithm, what is algorithm management, and maybe also what do we mean by logistics, and why does it present, such kind of fertile ground for this sort of algorithmic management?
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. So, I mean, algorithms literally are sets of rules that once executed achieve a goal. That goal might be a particular decision, or it might be solving a problem, or it could be baking a cake. Like people like to say that a recipe instruction set is an algorithm for producing a sort of desired result. Obviously, in this context, we're talking about computer algorithms. So essentially, we're in the kind of realm of quantification and calculation, and in particular, calculations that can be made far more quickly and involving far more information than people could. Um, so algorithmic management is, in the abstract, it's really the application of algorithmic technologies to workers, both to govern them in their work and also to have them produce data that is fed back into the algorithmic system through a sort of set of feedback loops in a kind of continuous improvement mechanism. What this practically looks like is workers who are often fitted with wearable devices or some form of tracking, might be an app, might be a handheld scanner. And as they are performing their work, they're engaging with a number of sort of data points, which will often be, for example, barcodes, or it could be through GPS or any number of sort of data tracking mechanisms. Bluetooth Low Energy is another one. Radio frequency identification can be another one. So they're sort of engaged with the system in real time. That is then means that they by working are producing data and feeding data into the system. And the algorithmic system can then decide how to organize, to give one example, how to organize workers' work and tell them what they should do next. More broadly, it might tell them what their productivity is over a period of time. More broader than that, it might tell their employer whether or not they should continue to employ it, for example. And logistics is, logistics is really about the movement of goods fundamentally. It obviously underpins the whole kind of e-commerce sector, but also, the sort of wider consumer society more broadly. It's important to note, as the Labour scholar Kim Moody does, that logistics itself has had a massive boom. It's been a massive boom industry over the past couple of decades in particular. And in particular, that's because of technologies enabling like a just-in-time model of logistics. So in the past, we might have thought of warehouses being full of stock, and when people want the stuff, then we take the stuff from the warehouse and we sort of ship it out. And when people don't want the stuff, it's just kind of in the warehouse, gathering dust and, occupying a piece of land that is expensive to rent. Nowadays, it's much more common that you get these kind of like hyperdynamic distribution hubs or fulfillment centers. And the purpose basically is to kind of keep goods moving all the time, and so that they are reaching each step within the distribution process just in time to fulfill the next step. And so stuff's kind of always this sort of facilitation of a kind of constant state of flow. Now, obviously, if you're going to organize the distribution networks like that, there are lots of moving parts, whether that's literally in terms of machinery, or whether it's in terms of vehicles, or whether it's in terms of the goods themselves. And so lots of calculations and a high degree of quantification of those things, and kind of constant calculation happening through the use of algorithms. And from there, it's a really short step to the total quantification of labor, which is not like those other things, but gets treated as if it is.
Yeah, and in terms of just kind of the day-to-day experiences of what it's like to work under these kind of under algorithmic management, I know it's quite different in terms of, the different interviewees, because they're in, some working for Uber, some working for retailers. So it's obviously a little bit different. But in terms of, some of the realities of what it's like to work for these places, what did you kind of learn through your research?
Yeah, I'll give maybe like one specific example and then a kind of like a general points. So like one specific example is I spoke to a worker who in the book I call Lorenzo. What he starts his shift by being given like a wearable scanner. It actually sort of he calls it a wristwatch, but it actually kind of it's like a huge sort of clunky thing that's strapped to your forearm. It's a Motorola WT4000 I learned with a ring scanner, which means that there's a lead coming off of the wristwatch onto his finger like a ring, and it means that he can scan things without having to pick it up or put it down. He can just point with his finger, and that will scan things. So so he comes onto shift. Gets given the scanner. It's you know, his personal one for the day, and he sort of logs in through it, and then he goes out into an enormous grid within a distribution center. He's working in kind of back end logistics for a high street supermarket chain, but this is way before you know, any kind of supermarket branded warehouses. This is kind of like things are coming off of aeroplanes and coming into this distribution center and then being divided up into individual supermarkets all across the city. So he goes about his work scanning pallets and boxes using barcodes and using this scanner. And as he's working, the scanner tells him what he has to do next. And so he keeps performing the work throughout the day, and the whole time, this device is collecting data on him. So it's collecting data about how quickly he's scanning things. So the intervals between scans. It's also collecting data about any downtime. So if he's had a period of inactivity because he's, you know, looking around the room, or he's not focused on the task at hand, or because he's nipped to the toilet, it's tracking his productivity then. And this feeds into a wider sort of disciplinary productivity system whereby he has to reach a certain percentage every day, let's say 90%. He's not told what it's 90% of. He just knows it's 90%. And the next morning, he's going to wake up to a text message that will tell him his percentage for the previous day's work. And therefore, because he's on a 0 hours contract, whether his work for the day is confirmed or cancelled. So we see this sort of quite tight interweaving of, you know, tight control of labor at work, and then quite a tight interweaving of those conditions with the wider employment conditions as well. And the general point that I found in a lot of these workplaces that was shared across, whether it was people who are drivers or riders, or whether it was people who are working in supermarket online shopping departments or further up the distribution chain, or whether they're working in Amazon or somewhere else, is that there's a real a sort of like a highly facilitated like anti-sociality to the work. Now, obviously, like being told to not talk at work is not novel to like the logistics sector, for example, but all interactions really are sort of channeled through the device to such an extent that even if you perhaps wanted to, in many workplaces, it's quite impossible to get to know your fellow workers, which obviously presents a problem for trying to organize, for example, within a workplace. And that kind of anti-sociality even extends, and we might talk about this a bit later, but it even extends to the sort of managers and supervisors themselves. And so all communication is really being kind of channeled through data rather than had between people.
Yeah, let's talk about kind of the managers and supervisors a little bit. So yeah, I mean, I guess making sense of how workers are put to use by managers requires us to think about the kinds of rules and strategies they might use to kind of maximize profit, basically. So this is kind of otherwise known as management theory. So could you just talk about how managerial forms and relationships in managers and workers, obviously, especially blue-collar workers, have kind of morphed in line with technological developments over recent decades?
Yeah, okay. So like management theory, I would say, begins as like a body of thought around the beginning of the 20th century. And you've got a number of kind of key thinkers around this time, of which Frederick Winslow Taylor is probably the most famous, but also people like Frank and Lillian Gilbreth or Elton Mayo. And these people are crucially like thinking about how to overcome, like, let's say, the indeterminacy of labor power. So I mentioned before that things like goods are not the same as labor, and that's because when an employer purchases labor, what they're actually purchasing is labor power, and then which is a potential rather than a concrete thing. And then once the person turns up at work, that labor power has to be actualized into actual labor through the course of working. So, to make the labor efficient and cost effective, basically, for what's being paid for it. And around the start of the 20th century, you've kind of got like a wider political context of a lot of labor struggles. Like this is like the really early days of, for example, in this country, like the capital L labor movement. But in America, it's also sort of coming off the back of a huge struggle for the 8-hour working day, for example, and a lot of really like militant like unionism, essentially. Taylor he writes this book called The Principles of Scientific Management, and in it he talks about a problem that he's identified within work that's fundamentally one of power, which he says that these workers basically are soldiering. Soldiering is the term he uses for kind of purposefully not working as hard or as fast as you could be. And he sort of says that at the root of this problem is that those workers, so at the time they're often working in quite sort of skilled groups where you'll have a group of men, and they typically are men who would have like between them kind of all the skills necessary to, produce whatever's being produced or to provide a particular sort of service. And between them, they kind of have all of the knowledge of the work and how to do the thing and how long it's going to take. And he says that gives them an awful lot of political control and power, essentially. And it means that in a funny sort of way, even though the employer is like holding the cash, they don't have any control over the actual labor process itself. And so he sets about trying to break up this like traditional knowledge, as he calls it, and he sort of creates this role of the manager, who is kind of a different figure from just like the employer. Like the purpose of the manager is to squeeze actual labor from the workers, and make it so that they can't sort of go slow on the job, for example, and maximize their own interests in doing so. So he's recognizing that managers and the employing class have different interests to the working class. And so his way of kind of going about this is to separate out the conception of labor from execution. And so he introduces the idea of people doing piecework or working to target and stuff like that. And a lot of the other management thinkers around the same time are trying different ways of sort of doing the same thing. So Elton Mayo, for example, he's an Australian management consultant who is incredibly hostile to trade union organizers. And he theorizes that the thing that a lot of sort of scientific managers in the Taylorist sense miss is that workplaces are really social places. And he says it's the job of managers to harness that sociality so that unions stay out, and so that managers can reap the benefit of sort of close-knit teams who are working together. Now, in terms of like technological development, really over the course of the 20th century, we see a really close relationship between the history of computing and the history of the administration of labor. And so these things are happening and being thought about in the 40s and the 50s, not simply with the birth of like the sort of first personal computers in the 70s, but of course it's kind of no coincidence that when we begin to see things like PCs or fax machines being rolled out, is through kind of like the infrastructure of work.
Yeah, and could you talk a bit about sort of how cybernetics fits into this? Because there was a chapter of the book and you mentioned CyberSyn project, for example, and this is something I've seen come up in lots of kind of left-leaning kind of theory, and maybe it took a slightly different angle, your book, when you're talking about how cybernetics, the politics of it, really.
Yeah, okay. What's the best way to talk about this? So I might start with we begin with sort of like the Taylorist idea, because obviously we're talking in kind of like heuristic terms, really. But the Taylorist idea is to sort of separate out conception and execution of work. Now, between those two things, if you set out if you like, the sort of like the planning and the administration of work and the doing of the work, there has to be some kind of relationship between the two, because otherwise the people who are doing the work wouldn't know what to do, and the people who are deciding what to do and why to do it don't know if the work has been done or if there's a delay or something like that. And so there is always kind of it opens up in separating out these two sort of functions within work. It opens up the need for communication between two kind of different groups, if you like. So within an algorithmic system, it's the use of wearables and the algorithmic system itself, for example, that gathers the data, so through tracking and stuff like that, but also administers the targets and sets workers to work, because what it's doing is it's working out on the basis of the data that's going into the system what needs to come out of it, whether it's through productivity goals or through disciplinary metrics or whatever. So the missing link here is really the idea of the feedback loop. And so the feedback loop being this kind of relationship between inputs and outputs, so that an output can then be reorganized as an input. And the idea is that it improves a system over time. And feedback loops are really like the central kind of contribution to like society, or like culture, or like just what like popular vocabulary that came from cybernetics. So cybernetics comes about in the sort of early to mid 20th century, around figures like Norbert Wiener, who want to kind of theorize communication and control and the way that communication can be used in control systems. Now, the reason this is like interesting, like important for management, and it gets applied to management by a guy called Stafford Beer in particular, but the reason it's sort of novel and interesting is that previously, when people were working in sort of directly in Taylor's lineage, for example, it led to theorizations of work that were all to do with kind of like perfecting work. And so, his idea was to be like, well, here's a work process and it's being done really inefficiently, so we need to make it super efficient, and we're going to do it this way. Then you get people like the Gilbreths coming along, and what they're sort of theorizing is that, well, if you can make work really efficient, there must be the most efficient way that you could make it work. And so they have this idea of like the one best way. And so they film bricklayers, for example, and try to think of how you would optimize a bricklayer's motion so that over time, and this is where time and motion studies comes from, they are laying as many bricks as can physically be laid by a human through the optimization of movement. Now, I won't go into sort of detail maybe, but in the sort of diversion that happens in the sort of around sort of the 40s and 50s, where after the war, lots of Japanese car manufacturers are really beginning to think deeply about how they rejuvenate their industry, and how they they've got these sort of mechanized industries, and how they can kind of economically get ahead again. And so they start sort of theorizing this idea of continuous improvement. And continuous improvement sort of breaks with the idea of one best way, because it says, well, there is no one perfect way to do things. You can only continuously improve things, and that's because your environment is always changing. Now, cybernetics kind of becomes important to this way of thinking, because cybernetics is all about the relationship between components of control and like the wider environment, and how these things are kind of operate, sort of inflecting upon one another. And so you get these sort of quite complex theorizations of cybernetic systems, where lots of feedback loops within feedback loops. And one of the most famous examples, as you say, was this idea of Project Cybersyn, which was designed by Stafford Beer. Stafford Beer was a management consultant, cybernetic management consultant, but he was also a leftist, and he was drafted in by Salvador Allende's government in Chile in the early 70s. And the idea basically was to kind of create this feedback loop model that could organize sort of production within society. So instead of having like a centrally planned economy, you could have a cybernetically planned economy, which is one that is being planned kind of in real time or as near to real time as possible, taking into account a number of variables and things that might be changing. So instead of having like a 5-year plan where you're expecting things to stay the same for 5 years, you can think about where things are right now and plan accordingly. And you can also sort of insert democratic impulses and so on. That project, because of the Pinochet's coup, didn't come about. However, this way of thinking, and whether or not sort of cybernetics itself is like a management theory is debatable, but like this way of thinking becomes really important for management theories, because suddenly you don't have to think about a one best way of doing things. And indeed, because you've got the use of computers that can reorganize communication within work, it's no longer even the case that managers have to be abreast of everything that's happening. You can offload, sort of epistemologically, you can offload like certain forms of knowledge to computers, as long as they are providing outputs that then workers can work on, and as long as it's optimizing the system overall, which is obviously it's quite a long-winded way of saying really that I suppose what cybernetics bring is this idea of feedback loops to work that can be sort of controlled and harnessed and acted upon by computers, rather than needing the continuous kind of oversight and intervention of managers.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. That was a big question. So let's talk about unions for a bit, because we've been sort of brushing around the subject. I think people like to use kind of rates of union membership as this kind of index to, the strength of leftism at any given moment, which can be helpful to some extent, but maybe simplifies or kind of flattens kind of the meaning of struggle. So maybe let's start by discussing what kinds of positive actions unions have done for workers, subject to algorithmic management. And then could you kind of elaborate on where they've maybe failed to stand up for workers' needs and wishes?
Yeah, so like this is an area of the book where like I try to sort of tread carefully, because I don't want to like diminish people's efforts or intentions around this stuff, because some good things that trade unions have done in this kind of area is some thinking about what would make certain technologies more ethical, and when we might need to raise them within negotiations with employers, for example, and more broadly, just having this kind of keen sense that technology has something to do with this wider sort of nexus of concerns that we're seeing around the sort of future of work, and that is one element of it that we need to account for. And those are good things. I suppose what I would say is that on the other hand, they have often struggled to grapple with questions of technology where it does not directly affect jobs and job losses. It doesn't directly affect pay. So where it doesn't sort of directly affect what have come to be known as the kind of like bread and butter of like, kind of union causes, there's often less said about technology itself beyond what's kind of rhetorical. And I think this is really because of really sort of a reluctance since the mid-20th century on the part of unions to stake a claim on the work process itself. And instead, there's been a kind of like a sort of shared with employers enshrining of the employer's right to manage, which means the right to manage and organize the work itself. Now, of course, when that work then becomes organized by a technology rather than by an actual human manager, and there are various sort of stakes arising from that, it puts unions in not a great position to begin to raise technology itself as something to stake a claim on. And it's kind of unfortunately sort of accompanied a wider narrowing of trade union scope which obviously like has its own politics, and that's been in part, particularly in this country, but also in the US, through successive governments like anti-union legislation. But it's meant that unions are often trying to hang wider concerns of technology around quite what I call like narrow ledges, so things like health and safety and stuff like that. This is getting better, and there's more work being done all the time, kind of on this. And trade union researchers have been sort of like put to work in sort of developing ideas around this. But I still think that where unions are at and where workers themselves are at are often quite far apart. And one of my worries is that a lot of the work being done, and it's good work, but a lot of the work being done by unions around algorithmic technologies is happening kind of at the level of like lobbying or sort of like press campaigning, and not really at the level of workers within workplaces themselves. And this can have, I think, poor effects. So one example I give in the book is a comparison between I'm speaking to a union organizer who in the book I call her Lane, and she's talking about a distribution branch of a supermarket where her union has achieved quite a high degree of union density, and they've used it to commission with the employer time and motion studies to be done on workers. And she sees it as, well, that then creates a sort of impartial benchmarking sort of exercise, around which then we can negotiate targets, which obviously, having now just said a bit about like the history of time and motion studies and where that really comes from, is maybe something we should be a bit more dubious about, skeptical of. And sure enough, like in the book, I compare this with the experience of a supermarket worker called Todd, whose union, which is a different union from Lane's, but whose union had similarly commissioned time and motion studies to be done as a kind of negotiating exercise. And it actually just resulted for him in having to push a much heavier trolley around the store. Because what they'd done then is the employer had optimized the space on the trolley and incorporated not only weight but measurement into the trolley, and it meant that he had to push around a heavier trolley. And I feel like this is sort of like what underpinning a lot of this is a sort of like a latent sort of partnership ethos that's held by a lot of trade unions, where they want to be in partnership with the employer. I often speak to trade unions who say, well, we want Amazon or whichever company to do well. We just don't want them to do well at the expense of our workers, which I can understand why you would say that, but it sort of partakes in a sort of like a sharing the benefit myth, that we can share the benefit of these technologies. And one of the questions that I raise in the book is well, what about if these technologies are kind of injurious to workers by design? Because that would be quite a different prospect, I think. And my worry is that often the way that trade unions approach these technologies is they kind of give too much away, concede too much ground before they even get to the negotiating table by accepting the very premise of these technologies in the first place, in a way that I don't always think we should. And I think one of the reasons why I look at a lot of workers themselves in the book is because a lot of workers are sort of taking it upon themselves to find their own ways to resist, often in quite disorganized ways. But I think it tells us something about attitudes towards technologies. And, it's never really been the case that trade union membership is, necessarily a decent metric for the activity of working class as a whole. One I think should be able to represent the other, but they are kind of two different things. And if they begin to diverge a lot, then I think that's a political problem.
Yeah, maybe you could give kind of a few illustrated examples of ways that workers are kind of subverting management processes, and maybe kind of link them in the final chapter. You have this concept of Mettis, which you sort of elaborate on. Maybe you could, talk about how that kind of links. What does it mean? How might workers use it to undermine algorithmic workflows?
Yeah, so in the book I speak to like a number of workers themselves about their work, and initially I really wanted to find out about how algorithms algorithm management was sort of reorganizing their work, but also their experience of work, their experience of management, and all this kind of stuff. But what I found was that often, many of them, although they weren't necessarily in trade unions themselves, they were nonetheless actually negotiating as they saw it with the algorithm of their own accord. And this took various forms. So in some places, it would involve sharing codes that they had managed to procure, that were sort of supervisory codes that would take them out of their productivity system. So if they were feeling overworked, then they could take an unsanctioned break of their own accord, and they could begin to sort of share this code around with trusted co-workers. It involved things like snooping on management computers to find out the sort of the what they're, if they weren't getting productivity information, they're anxious about it, then they could look it up on a management computer and potentially sort of slack off or take a break or take it on themselves to do that. In some cases, it was more about kind of either alleviating boredom, or as one person put it, sort of reclaiming dignity. So making intentional mistakes at work. The one worker I spoke to who was quite keen on this had basically spent a lot of time trying to work out through trial and error what the affordances of the wearable that he was using were. And so this might take the form of working out how he could sort of delete down his assigned work so that it would be break time sooner, or making kind of like amusing substitutions of goods. So in one case, this worker has decided that every time there's like a DVD been ordered through the online supermarket, someone's gone onto Asda.com or Tesco.com or whatever and ordered their shopping. Every time someone's ordered a DVD, he's going to substitute it for a DVD that's his favorite film because he thinks more people should see it. Now, like, these kinds of activities are obviously like highly sort of like individualized on the face of it, and often maybe quite cynical. When I spoke to workers and sort of like challenged them on like why they are doing these things, their reasons were politically valid ones. They were about dignity at work, or not, saying that, if I'm getting paid this much, then I'm going to make that bit of money worth it. From my perspective, or I'm bored and I'm annoyed because I was taken off. I used to be able to see who I was going to be on the shop with, and I'd be able to talk to them, and it make the day go faster. And now it doesn't happen, and so I'm kicking out. And a lot of workers who are involved in this stuff would sort of say, yeah, like, sure, it might be like sort of infantile behavior, whatever, but my reasons for doing so are valid ones. And also, when you would scratch the surface, you would find a degree of collaboration happening. Actually, people would make decisions about when and why they would share the code with someone, or make decisions about who to tell what, or people sort of sharing knowing nods if they've just done the same thing as another co-worker, and they're both sitting in the break room when it's not break time. So I don't want to like overstate any of these specific actions. But like when I was a union organizer, we began with where workers were at and what they were feeling agitated about. And in this case, that's what it was when I spoke to these workers. And it was often about dignity, which is something that's hard to put forward in this kind of set of demands. Now, I think like I also kind of wanted to like develop a sort of a bit of the theoretical framing around this stuff. So, I think that, a lot of these like tactics often involved kind of like a cunning intelligence, which is where like the word Mettis comes from. It's like this ancient Greek concept that sort of invokes like a deceitfulness, but also like an awareness of your surroundings, and having this kind of like sort of insight into in this case the algorithm's affordances, which I think the reason I kind of put that in there is because often these algorithms are kind of portrayed as omniscient and omnipotent, and here we've got actual workers who are kind of like trying to poke holes in the thing, which I sort of found kind of interesting because I think it says something about I guess like ways that workers themselves are sort of finding to engage politically. Now, even if they're not like forms of political action that we really recognize as being like capital P political, that's fine. But I did want to wonder what collective action we could imagine if we were willing to re-embrace, tactics that once upon a time were our political actions. Things like sabotage or subversion at work used to be part of what trade unions did or would advocate for or turn a blind eye to. And if we were to do that again, I think it'd be interesting to sort of see the results of a broadened union or organizer repertoire, because often when I've spoken to trade unions, they often, more than anything, feel constrained in what they can and can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good kind of note to wrap up our discussion of the book on. Just a couple of few questions now. I wonder if you could just kind of recommend us any other research or kind of organized activities going on that address this threat of management technologies and the specific issues that are addressed in your book.
Yeah, so I think much of the research in this area, and it's a kind of a good thing and a bad thing, is like moving very quickly towards like AI more broadly, which is like a very diffuse set of concerns and claims. And algorithmic management is one aspect of this. I would contend. I do think it's a type of AI, and certainly in the systems I was looking at. But the important thing is always to sort of, and the reason I say it's partly a good thing is because then I think AI has this wider like social currency, and people have this sort of people have feelings about it in a way that, if you say algorithmic management, people maybe don't have sort of initial sort of feelings about it until they understand it. But if we can begin to talk about what AI is and the different ways it can look, then I think I think it's a path worth walking down. The important thing is to sort of make sure that we're putting labor into those technologies. And so a recent book that is doing this is a book called Feeding the Machine by James Muldoon, Mark Graham, and Callum Cant. But also there's a recent book called The Eye of the Master by Matteo Pasquinelli, which is about it's like a social history of AI. And I think both of these things, what they're trying to do is look at these technologies as sort of material and social processes or innovations, not merely as kind of like something that's been dreamt up out of nothing by Silicon Valley in various shades of blue, and that they're trying to sort of bring these technologies sort of down to earth. So those would be sort of two places that I would suggest looking at. It's also worth saying that there is also like organizing happening in a lot of these workplaces all the time, and that's sort of taking different forms, and so it's often worth kind of keeping track of the different developments there that often don't make it into books. So some unions are being sort of tied up at the minute in quite lengthy battles around recognition. So Amazon, both in the UK and the US, that's happening, whereas others are sort of maybe a bit more able to tackle AI and algorithmic technologies more squarely on its own terms. So I'm thinking of like the Writers Guild of America in the US, for example. It's kind of a mixed picture.
Great. My final question is just what you're working on at the moment, if anything. Obviously, you've just published a book, but
Yeah, no, I am working on a couple of things. So one thing I'm quite excited about is I'm in the sort of late stages of working on a piece for Logic's magazine, formerly Logic in the US, which is it's about the use of it's about the temporalities that are produced by technologies like scan guns within distribution centers. So often these technologies, because of the productivity metric, they sort of, I say, reduce the future to sort of 12 seconds at a time. And by that, I'm referring to the fact they have often a countdown timer telling the worker how long they've got to get the next task. And having grown up in South Yorkshire in England, where there's a lot of these warehouses now, they often sit on the sites of former mines, old collieries. And those, as listeners in the UK know, those areas used to be really strong areas of trade union struggle, that were largely defeated in the 80s, or were defeated in the 80s. And so I kind of like tied together like the visions of the future that were held at a time of like high industrial militancy, and the sort of like deletion of the future that is sort of done within contemporary warehouses, and try to think about the politics of time through the modern scan gun, but also the sort of defeat of the miners' strike. And then I'm also working on a review about a new book that I'm currently really enjoying by Tiziana Bonini and Emiliano Traoré, which is called Algorithms of Resistance. And yeah, I'd actually recommend people look at that one as well, because it looks at sort of algorithmic resistance, not just within work, but also across society more broadly.
Great, sounds really interesting. And I've not heard of the other books either, so yeah, lots on the reading list. Craig, thanks very much.
Thanks so much for having me, Louisa. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.